Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course, Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today, we are going to discuss, in continuation with our previous lectures, on social change in India. So, the first component of social change in India, we have discussed about Sanskritization, and where we have discussed briefly about Professor M.N. Srinivas' work on how he described the shift of this Brahmanization to Sanskritization, how he coined the term of Sanskritization, and especially the evolution of the caste and how the transformations and how the shifts within the caste systems have occurred. And that lecture we have actually ended with a kind of how our society has been framed starting from Indus Valley civilization and till the Gupta period, and that is where a form has been given to the built form, especially the temple architecture have started. And in the second lecture series, we did discuss about the westernization aspect, which Professor M.N. Srinivas also have talked about it. So here we westernization, it is not only from the European aspects or the colonial aspects. We talk from starting from 11th, 12th centuries onwards, how the Islamic rurals have invaded India and how different influences have taken place with the Islamic invasions, starting from the Delhi Sultanates, and we briefly discussed about the Qutub Shahi complex, Alai Darwaja, and how there's a blend of Indian motives, the cultural motives, and how there's a blend of both Indian origin architectural styles as well as with the Islamic, what they have known and what they have brought here and what they have merged here. So this is one thing, and then later on we discussed about different stages of colonial invasions, and starting from Portuguese, the Dutch, Danish, and the French, and the late British. So till 1947, till the independent India, we did discuss about what kinds of transformation process, especially the major infrastructural network, how the whole country, especially with the ongoing industrialization processes, improved trade and economical routes, sea routes, administrative systems, and at the same time how the irrigation network has been developed. So in that way, how the education has brought the medium of instruction as in English, and that has actually also gradually reversed the role of the caste system, especially the order of the caste system. Earlier, the traditional Brahmins who are more valued for their knowledge and the traditional wisdom, and in many of the traditional schools they were not even allowing the other caste people. But whereas this uniform way of education systems have actually given a scope for everyone to get educated, and in that process the whole habits have changed, whole dress have changed, whole the way the man has conducted his life have changed, and it has reversed the whole orders within the society. So now, in fact, it has changed the economical positions from various classes came forward, and they have been part of various development processes. In that way, this westernization process, especially with the both Islamic and the colonial influences, and towards the end the industrialization processes added as a changing factor, and with that a lot of cultural changes happened. And now In the post-independent aspect, this is a lecture which I will try to conclude the social change in India, especially giving an overview of the modernization. So this has as I discussed with you in the earlier two lectures on the Sanskritization, then the Westernization, and gradually how these modernistic ideologies have come forward. And today we are talking about the globalization. So I will briefly discuss about the modernization and to globalization. So a good example to start with, especially from the architectural and planning perspective, is to discuss the case of Chandigarh. After the independence, that time Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, have thought about, because when the Punjab was splitted from east and west, the capital of Punjab, Lahore, went onto the Pakistan side, and here the Punjab and Haryana, which was not having any unique capital, and that is where of that time's political authorities, especially Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, have vision to create a capital city which can actually serve this Punjab state, and his visionary ideas towards the modernistic, how we can address the existing vulnerabilities and how we can, because of their education in European education and their awareness of the global cultures, and they were perceiving the Indian to be more of a how we can bring the social equality and democratic ideologies through the city planning approaches. And this is where initially the mayors was appointed, was commissioned for developing this plan, and then he developed a kind of fan-shaped layout, and later on I think because of some accident it was discontinued, and that is where again the team went in search of some architect, and that is where the Swiss architect of Le Corbusier has commissioned to design, and he along with his cousins, they came forward and they started looking at how we can design the city. And he considered the city as a living organism, and basically it's a kind of human anatomy. The way he positioned the government buildings as ahead, the administrative position which thinks over, and the sector 17 which have the heart, which is the life of the city, and you have the parks and playfields which are the open areas of the lungs, the breathing spaces, especially the leisure values, the gardens, the rose gardens, so all these things in the lungs, and the roads, footpaths which are the connecting parts of it, the arteries, and that is how the industries placed both in the limbs. So this is a kind of layout, and the Le Corbusier's idea is about making a kind of spacious layout as well as, and what he did was he divided the whole city into kind of sectoral pattern, and each sector was about less than 800 meters by 900 something odd meters, and each sector has its own neighborhood qualities, especially if you talk from the Lewis Mumford's neighborhood unit. So each sector has its own shopping area, its own park, its own school. This kind of sectoral approach has been adopted, and I'll just show you a small film on how Le Corbusier's approach.
Welcome to Chandigarh, a union territory in northern India that serves as the joint capital of the Indian states of Punjab and Haryana. Chandigarh was a grand social experiment started in 1952 by former Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Swiss architect Jean-Pierre Le Corbusier, who wished to create a city where democratic socialism gave individual rights and increased living standards to all its inhabitants. When viewed statistically, Chandigarh may appear to be fulfilling its goals. It possesses the highest per capita income rate and human development index in India, a country known for its problems regarding poverty and proliferation of slums. While Chandigarh has achieved prosperity on average, there is a sharp social divide that exists today. Over 1/3 of its population lives in slums on the outskirts of the planned city, unable to find proper housing within the official city limits due to overpopulation. Chandigarh, because of its inflexible planning, has developed class divisions due to unexpected overpopulation, thus failing to stay true to its founder's original purpose of social equality. An examination of Chandigarh's historical development provides an insight into why it failed to reach its intended goals. When Nehru envisioned his new city, he desired the following for its inhabitants: equal rights for all communities in the Indian family, rising standards of living for the masses, and the preservation of individual rights. To achieve these goals, Le Corbusier originally designed the residential areas to promote social justice. He split the living section of his plan into neighborhood sectors, dividing peoples of different social classes amongst them accordingly. Le Corbusier recognized that social classes were a reality. However, he strove to give all the inhabitants of his planned city equal core rights and resources. All sectors were given the same necessities: a central area with commodities such as shops, health centers, and places of worship. To prevent individuals from gaining too much power, Le Corbusier introduced many regulations and mechanisms to oversee the construction of residential buildings. These included zoning policies to limit property area and frames control to regulate building heights, making sure no house stood too high over another. It was when Le Corbusier's plans were executed that problems began to arise. Due to financial issues, the master plan's construction was split into two phases. In Phase 1, sectors 1 to 30 would be built, and in Phase 2, sectors 31 to 47 would be built. The construction of Phase 1, which lasted from 1966 to 1968, was mostly consistent with Le Corbusier's plans, and most of the important parts of the master plan were built, such as the Capitol Complex, City Center, and many neighborhood sectors. However, Phase 2's construction saw the influx of population caused by the economic growth created by Phase 1. In order to keep up with the population growth, the new residential sector's densities were increased, and smaller, multi-storied residential apartments were built. The population continued to grow even after construction ended in the 1990s, and several neighboring villages were built to accommodate the numerous immigrants. Meanwhile, the housing costs were steadily increasing due to the now antiquated property regulations instilled by Le Corbusier, forcing even more people to live in the surrounding villages and slums. Chandigarh's planners, including Le Corbusier, poorly predicted the population growth that would result from its construction and subsequent economic prosperity. As a result, the people suffered the loss of the rights that Nehru promised them, despite the burgeoning economic growth. Because the planners focused on achieving economic prosperity rather than concentrating their efforts on the increasing populace's welfare, they lost sight of their original goals for the people. Chandigarh was intended to serve as a city for the people. Its original design by Le Corbusier aimed to give its populace individual rights and increased living standards. However, because of an unexpectedly high population growth, planners compromised these original values of social justice in favor of economic prosperity. The story of Chandigarh raises an important question. Should governments value the individual's importance over that of society as a whole, or should they value society over the individual? Chandigarh was designed for the sake of the individuals, but it has chosen to focus on its own prosperity as a whole, resulting in social inequality. Some may see Chandigarh as a great achievement, but in reality it has achieved goals different than those envisioned by its founders, failing to fulfill their dreams as a city of true social equality.
So, what you have seen, especially with the kind of approach how Chandigarh has been built, and what the visionaries have visioned and what it has achieved, that is where the social reality and how this is the cultural understanding. So the one side you are building a city and how the city have expanded and how people have responded to this kind of modernistic approach. Like in fact, one of the reason, if you look at the monotonous buildings and monotonous concretization, we can say a kind of concrete jungles of if you look at it, that was a time, especially with the prefab industries and the concrete technology was upcoming, and that was a kind of opportunity for building a city with the huge mass production techniques, and that is where the plazas have come, so vast plazas, completely concrete bedded. And but if you look at the other side of it, and especially one of the important thing, how much waste it has also generated in building such a big city. And that is where one has to look into Nekchand's rock garden, how he collected all the waste and how he developed in a kind of artistic way of through the waste. It could be with the concrete pebbles, it could be with the broken toilets. All these things have been created as one of the reusable resources. So, and also the symbol of Chandigarh, the iconic symbol of Chandigarh, the open hand, which talks about a kind of open hand, which means an open hand will never able to touch any weapons. It's a symbol of peace, and that is a kind of understanding towards, because each and every symbol and even the kind of program it was looked at, the kind of architectural program, how the buildings are programmed, so in a more of a uniform nature, and rather than the earlier ways of dominant culture, it has been addressed in a more of a kind of modernistic approaches. So if we move on from little modernistic approaches, and there is also one phase we have to talk about, the postmodernism. So I'm not saying this modernism and postmodernism, they are one after another, but that is where when the culture interacts, how the culture has embeds with the interfaces with the modernistic ideologies, that is where we talk about the postmodernism. So especially in the course of culturally responsive built environments, it is important to bring the spatial production, and especially not only from the city planning perspective, but also it also talks about the buildings, how the modernistic ideologies, when addressed in a cultural context, how it will be shaped. So another good example in the same region of Punjab, one is Anandpur Sahib, which is called Virasat-e-Khalsa. It was actually a Sikh museum, and it was designed by architect Moshe Safdie. So here, what you can see here, the thorough consideration of the landscape and how Safdie have considered the landscape, and especially how, in order to bring to build a Sikh museum, and how his approach, a design approach, have considered the vernacular understanding of the Sikh culture and the historical aspects of it, how the journey of 500 years journey, how it has. So because this is a museum which has to give an immersive experience of the whole history of the Sikh culture and how they are progressing and major events they have associated with, and because this is where it is also to do contribution to the nation building. So what you see is a kind of you see here the lotus. So it's the whole landscape is coming up. The whole idea is, so the lotus is facing towards the sun, and these are all the galleries which were made. So unlike any other galleries, unlike any other museums or any other, so what they do is they compartmentalize the galleries, either to put the portraits of Sikhs or any other things. But what Moshe Safdie have looked at it is kind of, he looked at the kind of context of the cultural context in the form of a narratives, in the form of a performative, in the form of an experience. So the museum has to give an immersive experience to the visitor, and that is where he used a very innovative technological approaches, where the whole galleries are filled with kind of various mural sort of things, various art compositions, explaining the whole story with both the audio visual experiences, and so how the whole journey have started, and how various stories, various narratives, various performatives have been coded into the kind of one it's a kind of revealing the significance of the culture. So that is where, as I said, as I explained to you before, the roof geometry projected in the skyline reveals the plan of the individual floors, and one cluster with 5 flower-like petals evokes the lotus projecting skywards. So it's built from the nature, inspiration from the nature. And the second crescent-shaped cluster creates a symphony of shapes against the skyline, dominated by a vertical sword-like triangular, because sword is one of the important element of the Sikh sculpture, triangular spire that hovers above the roofline. So below at the center of historic museum is a large multi-level exhibition space shaped like a ship rising dramatically from water below. So basically the whole water, once you can see when you're walking on the ramps, you'll see below there's a huge water. So basically you'll get that understanding of how the river movements, and because Punjab is known for its rivers and a rich agricultural context. So it both faces downstream towards the sacred buildings of the town, creating the illusion of dynamic movement. So the whole environment is a kind of, the whole illusions were created to create a dynamic movement. And that's what Moshe Safdie talks about. The timelessness is perhaps the most meaningful quality one can ascribe to a building. And another example I would like to give you is, especially it's a very recent example. In fact, this is in Madhya Pradesh, in Bhopal, in the capital city of Madhya Pradesh, which is where the tribal museum. So here, when we are talking about addressing the culture, now because of the whole urbanization process, the way the people are living in urban setting, it's all about multi-story buildings or a daily routine network of travel and everything. So how we can address this culture, and how the rural atmosphere could be brought into and the skills and the crafts could be brought into the urban setting, that is also one of the effort. So architect Revati Kamath and also artist Harichandan Bhattiji were mainly involved in the setting of this tribal museum in Bhopal. And here, even again, the tribal museum, the concept of tribal museum has been discussed, and initially it was initially planned how we can classify the galleries. So can we classify by region? Then with a thorough discussion of various experts, and so then they thought how we can actually come up with the concepts through the lifestyle of the themes within the lifestyle. For instance, the first gallery talks about the religion, the faith, and the second gallery talks about their habitats, the dwellings, and the third one that talks about their traditions, the way they work, the kind of livelihood traditions, and also how the myths have been translated into an abstract settings of an artifacts. For example, what you see is a kind of a myth which has been collected from various tribal, so it is a story of the bamboo. So it was basically, there was 4 brothers and 1 sister, and one day when it was a kind of nomadic life, so that is where all the 4 brothers wanted to have the flesh of that girl, though it is their own sister. But one of them was really not happy with it, and he tried to save her, but then he was helpless, and finally he buried the little part of her that he could save and drenched it with his tears. So that is where the people believe that this has given the rise of bamboo, grown into the bamboo, and the sister became holy as Kandariya Kanya and the bamboo goddess. So this whole story is portrayed, and the whole artistic setting has been exaggerated to fill the volume of the museum. So the experience one travels within that museum, it actually talks about various myths behind these stories, and so like that. Similarly, look at this, the kind of play gallery, the children's play gallery. So today, if you look at when was the last time we touched a human being and played? So this is one of the questions, because play is an important aspect of one's life, because now with the digital technology, with the digital tools, we are losing that human touch and we are losing that humanized landscape, because in that process what is happening is we are not understanding the reality of it. So in fact, play is something where you touch, where you share, where you express your strengths, where you develop your where you understand your weaknesses, where you cope up with it, that kind of, and understand that it is basically the relationship between man and nature. So this whole process, and even the music, the arts, so how different the arts is also a way how an human intellect could be brought out. But in today's generation, with a lot of digital technologies and a lot of technological innovations, so how man's life have changed in a very drastic way. In fact, if I have to look at it, that is where we talk about. I think we are talking in the kind of how the postmodernism, how the culture plays an important role, especially with these modernistic ideologies, and how the culture interfaces with it, and how it gives a kind of attractive meaning and a kind of local meaning. So basically the modernistic approach, but very much linked with the kind of local meanings. So these are some examples I just showed you as a kind of how an architects have tried to relate with culture, starting from a city scale to a much bigger scales of museum, and especially in Virasati Khalsa it talks about the community, a Sikh community, and whereas in tribal museum it talks about the region and various communities and various, so it talks about the whole lifestyle of it. And this is where we are talking about the globalization, and because the first phase we are talking about the interaction between man and nature, and here we are talking about the interaction between man and technology, especially in the early 19th century onwards. That is where the technological innovations like telephone, steam engine, everything has gone out, and the industrialization process have come out, and especially with the IT sector has boomed, and that is the one of the important aspect of exchange of trade, and that is where we talk about the globalization. So in globalization, one of the important person we have to refer is Anthony Giddens' work on social theory, especially he talks about how the globalization has impact on the local cultures, and very in-depth studies, but I'm not going very much in depth, but I'm just looking at to give you an idea of where we are now and where we started. So it is the globalization is described as the intensification of worldwide social relationships which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. And this involves a change in the way we understand geography and experience localness. I lived in Europe for many years, and then in many of the countries, like for instance when I was in London, I never missed my country, because whenever I have to go for a temple, I have a temple there. Whenever I have to go eat a food, I have a local food there. So in that way, despite of being far away, miles away and skies away, but still we are able to get that localness. So that is the importance of the globalization, because it is irrespective of the distance, irrespective of the location, it basically intensifies the worldwide social relationships. Sometimes in order to send a post, it might take 30 days or 40 days to reach England, but now it takes a minute or a second to just get you a message. Or so in that way, if you look at what is shut down, like recently the Indian system has shut down the telegraph system, because of usage of the internet activities. So in that way, the traditional it has an impact on certain traditional systems. At the same time, it has fastened certain networks and relationships. Now here one of the important questions is whether globalization have produced technology or the technology have produced the globalization. This is always a two-way process. So the whole setting has promoted the technology to happen, and technology has promoted the globalization. So it's always a two-way process. So one of the aspects we are talking is the globalization and delocalization. So activities and relationships being uprooted from local origins and cultures. And one important element in this has been the separation of work from the home. So in fact, today you are able to listen to my lecture sitting in somewhere in America or England is because it is, you don't need to come for my lecture to a classroom. So that's the technology which has brought you that whatever you can do it from your home. So you don't need to come for a classroom. So, but in that case, how the impact it is. Earlier there was a guru and a shishya, and where a disciple and a master, they used to sit in a classroom under a tree, and it was a two-way process. So one is understanding the other. But here it has a multiple interpretations, and in fact even now, though we have any discussion forums or any other things, but that personal contact has much beyond anything. And in that way, the way it is not only the component which you are learning from a guru, but the lifestyle, the pattern, the discipline, everything is a part and package of that training. But now it is only a part of only that education. So that is where the holistic component is broken into different aspects. And another important person I have to refer, especially from the architecture and urbanism perspective, is Anthony D. King, Spaces of Global Cultures, Architecture, Urbanism and Identity. So especially the globalization and the decline in power of national governments. Earlier, there used to be a king, and the king used to have a control of his location or in the region where he used to administer, and he used to impose the rules, and he used to control the economy, and he have certain power in controlling the local economies. But in this situation, if something happens in America, it will have an impact in India. When the WTC towers have been collapsed, obviously if you look at the impact in the Indian economy, it is a huge damage to certain industries. If an accident happens in Middle East in an oil reserves, obviously it will have an impact on some the American continent, and as well as in the Asian side of it. So which means something happens somewhere, it have ripples elsewhere in the world. So this is how the globalization has brought one good thing, and these are some of the negative aspects of it. And the internationalization of financial markets, of technology, and some of manufacturing and services bring with them a new set of limitations upon the freedom of action of nation states. So today a prime minister cannot alone control the national economy, because it is completely attached with many other aspects of internationalization of the financial markets. And impact of globalization is most felt through the extent to which politics everywhere are now essentially market driven. So it is not just the governments can no longer manage their national economies. So as I just said to you, it is not just in the hands of a chief minister or a prime minister who can control the nation. Because it is a ripples system. Something happens somewhere and it has an impact here. Anthony King talks about understanding of globality and global culture are never static, because it's a dynamic process. What we think of as a globalization changes from day to day according to different developments, political, technological and economic. In fact, if we talk about, for example, if you look at this photograph, what you see 50 years before Singapore, and what you see 50 years after, what is Singapore. So, and this is where it is changing every day. In fact, if you, in our previous lectures of Doha, how it has changed from the oil-based liberalization process economies and the liberalized economies, how things have changed every day due to various political interventions and the policies and various other developments. Similarly, like a good example of Singapore is a knowledge-based economy, because now earlier we were talking about the natural resources, how it has fetched up the economies, but now knowledge-based economies especially and that is where you can sit in any corner of the world and how you are actually able to. But in this whole process, yes, now the whole world has become a kind of consumerist society rather than a production oriented. So if you take any of your friends, take sample of 10 to 50 and see how many of them are actually relied on their business, which is more of a production oriented, how much of they are producing and how much they are consuming. So that tells you the scale which kind of society we are. Globalization and risk and hazards linked to the industrial production, especially when the globalization process, if something is produced at some country and it is packed in some other country, it is marked, branded in some other country. So in this whole process, because if some risk happens somewhere, it spreads all over and it has a bigger impact. And similarly, in any kind of disease occurs somewhere and it spreads all over. So there is a potential of risks becoming globalized, and the globalization and the impact of multinationals on local communities. So all this now coming to a kind of branding. So the food is now getting branded, the food culture is getting branded, the clothes are getting branded, and the furniture is also getting branded, and this is where the branding and globalization. So obviously if you talk about the IKEA coming to India, so the other side, yes, it might bring the foreign investments, but then obviously it will talk about from the planning perspective, the foreign investments have to be allocated in the planning process, and how it can also, we have to make sure that how it may not affect the local economies. For example, and when the IKEA comes into it, even if they scale down the prices of it, how it may not affect the local carpenters' livelihoods and things like that. So because a huge number of local economies which may be affected because of this branding, and that that one can see, in fact, in any of the city, if you take especially when the IT sector have come up, for example in a city like Bangalore or in Hyderabad, 15 years before, people used to be able to afford, even an auto rickshaw driver used to be able to afford a small house. But in today's context, because of the multinationals having their investments in the Indian context, and the people who are working on on-site jobs and who are getting higher paid salaries rather than any other government sector. So you can see a huge economic disparity with the IT sectors and the other sectors. And the more the disparity is coming, obviously the real estate market is also blending with the market, raising the market expenditures. And that is where today an auto rickshaw, it's very difficult for a person to own a house. So the person who is earning more, obviously it has improved affordability on the vehicles, affordability on homes, and that has resulted a huge expansion of the cities, sometimes in a congestion component of it, and the traffic jams. Today, once Bangalore city was a kind of beautifully green city, but today one can experience how much traffic jams it is facing, because this is where improper growth, especially on one side, the IT sector, and the other side, other industries are coming up, and to serve these particular sectors. So obviously, from an architectural perspective, one has to really think about how it should make an impact on the local cultures and their livelihoods and the cultural economies. I think till now we have just discussed about the social change in India. So if I start from the Sanskritization, Westernization, Modernization, Post-modernization, and the globalization today where we are. So we started with the man and nature, and how he interacted with nature, and how he framed a society, and how he framed his administration setup, how he framed an institution as a marriage and other things, and in the westernization process, how he has been influenced, how he has borrowed, and how he has it's a two-way process. At the same time, you gave something and they brought something, so that molding process. And in the colonization, obviously with repeated encounters of various invasions and various administrative new setup, new institutions. And in the industrialization, which brought a very drastic change in the expansion of urban centers, and which has definitely have affected the local economies and produced the mass productions, and the whole scenario has become a very drastic change. And in the globalization, especially after the IT and other internationalization process, now it is not in one man's control. It is now as a ripple system. Something happens somewhere and it affects somewhere. So it is not in anyone's control. So now a king or a ruler or a dictator who has a defined territory, now he doesn't have much role in shaping his place. So that is how we are in this phase. And the human interaction have gradually reduced. So it is a time for us to look back into our cultures and see how we can bring both global and local, that is where the global part of it. And thank you very much.